All right, now that it is 5:30, we will call to order the first meeting of the new year, the Deschutes County Planning Commission, Thursday, January 29th. Our first order of business is to elect a chair and vice chair for the year January 25. At this time, do we have a motion or comments for a chair? Commissioner Altman,
I would like to nominate Commissioner Cyrus for chair.
and do I have a second on that?
I'll second it.
And Commissioner Altman, why would you choose Commissioner Cyrus?
I don't think he's served yet.
Correct.
And I also think he has a lot of experience running public meetings, and I think that he would do a great job.
Perfect. And Vice Chair, do you have any input on your second?
Pretty much the same, yeah. I think that Commissioner Cyrus is really familiar with Robert's rules. I think he can keep us orderly and timely and kind of move us through the agenda in a way that will be substantive, but also focused. So that's why I plan to support Commissioner Cyrus.
Terrific. And is there any other discussion on this matter? Okay, I will move to take a vote. Commissioner Altman, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Stottkamp?
Aye.
Commissioner Kelly? Commissioner Hovkamp? Commissioner or Vice Chair Curis?
Aye.
Commissioner Cyrus?
Abstain.
And I too will vote yes. That is 6 yes and 1 abstention. Our next order would be Vice Chair. Do we have any motions?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I nominate Commissioner Altman.
Do we have a second?
Second that.
And Commissioner Cyrus, your thoughts?
Well, she's got a lot of experience, highly organized, and I think she'd do an excellent job.
Terrific. And Commissioner Kelly? All righty. And we will move to vote unless we have any other comments. All righty. Commissioner Cyrus?
Aye.
Vice Chair Curis?
Aye.
Commissioner Stottkamp?
Aye.
Commissioner Kelly? Commissioner Hovkamp? And I assume you will abstain?
Aye.
And I will vote yes. So again, 6 yay, 1 abstention. We now have a new chair and vice chair. I will hand the gavel over. And it will now be Chair Cyrus's to take over.
I mean, I'm fine with you continuing your meeting if you'd like.
Typically, the new chair would drive the bus. I do not mind closing out this one at last if you would prefer.
Yeah, I just assume you finish your term. You started the meeting. Let's finish it.
Okay, all righty, we'll hand her on over then. All righty, our first order, or next order of business then is the approval of minutes for December 12th. Has everyone had a chance who attended to read them, and has anyone made any corrections with Tracy?
I made a correction.
And that was it Collins versus Carson's? Okay, we made that then, yes. All righty, all in favor of approval that were here, and that would be 5 of us. Aye? Aye, alrighty, 5 ayes, 2 abstentions. The next, is there anyone online, Adam, or on the phone for public comment? And do we have anyone in the public of Sawyer Room who would like to make public comment that does not pertain to tonight's agenda? Alrighty, next item is public hearing, clear and objective housing text amendments. Kyle Collins. Perfect.
Good evening, Commissioners. For the record, Kyle Collins, Associate Planner.
That's just like,
If you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my screen so I can run a presentation. Sure we can see that. Okay. As the chair pointed out, this is the time and place set for hearing on file number 247-24-000-705-TA. It's concerning amendments establishing clear and objective housing development standards as mandated by House Bill 3197, and staff will outline the hearing procedures that follow. On the screen here, you'll see a URL link to the project website. You can find all the record materials associated with this project thus far, including public comments have been submitted, staff reports, memos to the Planning Commission, et cetera. The Planning Commission will hear oral testimony, receive written testimony, and consider the testimony submitted at this hearing. Please note that the hearing is also being recorded. The Commission may make a decision on this matter today, continue the hearing to a date certain, or leave the written record open for a specified period of time. The hearing will be conducted in the following order. Staff, representing Deschutes County as the applicant, will give a brief report on this issue. And we will then take testimony from any agencies or interested parties. And then following testimony, the Commission can request staff to answer any additional questions. Please note that this is a hybrid hearing with both in-person and remote participation. For any in-person participants, if you wish to testify, please fill out a blue sign-up sheet and submit it to staff. You can find those sheets on the right side of the room here. After your name has been called, please come up to one of the tables at the front of the room before beginning your testimony. And before starting your testimony, please provide your first and last name as well as your mailing address. For any remote participants, if you want to testify, you must be logged into Zoom or have called in using the Zoom dial-in option. When the chair asks if anyone would like to testify, you will need to use the raised hand feature to notify the Commission. To do this, you need to press the raise hand button on your computer or smart device, or if you've dialed in, dial *9. Any written testimony can be submitted to staff. Please hand it to me after you've presented your oral testimony. And if you're participating remotely, you can submit your written testimony via email to the address that you see here on the screen. Please note that the chair and staff are responsible for conducting an orderly hearing. Any testimony or behavior which is inappropriate will be addressed and may result in that member of the public being removed from the hearing. Questions to and from the chair may be entertained at any time at the chair's discretion. Cross-examination of people testifying will not be allowed. However, if any person wishes to ask a question of another person during that person's testimony, please direct your question to the chair after being recognized. The chair is free to decide whether or not to ask such questions of the person testifying. Prior to the commencement of the hearing, any party may challenge the qualifications of any commissioner for conflict of interest. This challenge must be documented with specific reasons supported by facts. Should any commissioner be challenged, the member may disqualify himself or herself, withdraw from the hearing, or make a statement on the record of their capacity to hear and decide this issue. At this time, do any members of the commission need to set forth any information that may be perceived as a conflict of interest?
Does any commissioner have anything to disclose? And if so, please state the nature of same and whether you can proceed.
All right, hearing none, does any party wish to challenge any commissioner or member of the hearings body based on conflicts of interest at this time?
As no challenges are presented, the hearing is now open. Staff will proceed with a brief report.
All right, I'll start by saying many of the commissioners have already heard some version of the report I'm about to give. It is pretty technically dense, and we'll try to get into as many details as the commissioners like to bring up. But generally, I'm going to try to provide a pretty 10,000-foot overview because this is, again, a relatively dense project, and it covers a lot of areas of the code that we're proposing to amend here. And so I want to make sure that everybody either listening at home as well as the commissioners have a clear understanding of what we're doing. So first, I'm just going to give a background of what set this project off. So starting in 2017, the state legislature passed a series of bills to encourage efforts to expand housing and the development of housing statewide. Several of these bills modify the Oregon Revised Statutes, or the ORS section, in the following ways. Specifically, it limits all local governments to what they describe as clear and objective standards, conditions, and procedures regulating the development of housing, including needed housing. What that means in practice is any adopted standards cannot have the effect of discouraging needed housing through unreasonable cost or delay. Initially, those clear and objective housing statutes only applied to incorporated cities within acknowledged urban growth boundaries. So, for example, in Deschutes County, the cities of Bend, Redmond, et cetera, have actually already gone through this process over the last several years. But in 2023, a new House Bill 3197, was passed, and it expanded those clear and objective standards to the following areas, which are important for our meeting here tonight. Those are unincorporated communities that were designated in a county's acknowledged comprehensive plan after December 5th, 1994. We have a few of those, Tumalo and Terrebonne being the primary examples. Our non-resource lands, this is probably the biggest swath of the county that we deal with housing development. So these are places like our R10 zones, our MUA10 zones, et cetera. And then finally, areas that are zoned for rural residential use as defined in the ORS. So the provisions of House Bill 3197 become effective on July 1st of 2025. These standards are not technically in effect in Deschutes County at this time, but that really is our deadline to pass a series of amendments, starting with this first package that you're reviewing here tonight. Specifically as it applies to housing outside of any resource zone properties. So this is not intended to apply to places like the exclusive farm use lands or forest zone lands. Any discretionary standard that applies to zones outside of those areas after that July 1st date of this year may be challenged by applicants, acknowledging that it may not be clear and objective, and thus those standards cannot apply to specifically to the development of housing moving forward. So that's all a very technical way of describing the series of bills that have passed to this point. But generally, what does that actually mean? So clear and objective standards are intended to use terms, definitions, and measurements that provide for a consistent interpretation. If you were to take two people off the street and give them a clear and objective standard, ideally they should arrive at the same conclusion in applying that standard across a variety of projects. So there's no need for any type of discretion in the application of the standard. So language like compatible or adequate or orderly, those are relatively open-ended, open to interpretation by the reviewer at hand, and thus those would not be described as clear and objective standards. So there's a variety of possible approaches that you can take to craft clear and objective standards. These are just, again, very high-level approaches. The first thing that you can do is apply what we describe as true-false statements. Those are used to evaluate developments and whether they've satisfied a very specific criterion. So the example I provide is the structure on a lot or parcel within a rural residential zone? The answer to that is either yes or no. It's a true-false statement. The next possible option are counts and measurements. These are standards that have counts and measurements, very specific quantitative standards that can be applied across either a minimum range, a maximum range, or any possible range in between those two. You can think of things like our setback standards or building heights being limited to a certain foot. And then finally, you can do things like provide lists and menus. So this provides a little bit of flexibility for applicants, but it involves saying, if you are going to pursue a development, maybe you need 2 out of the following 10 items included in that development in order for it to pass through this particular review. We've included a few of those throughout the code, but those are relatively limited. Most of our clear and objective standards fall in the first 2 true-false statements or counts and measurements, at least for the portion that we're going to review here tonight. So next, I'll go through the proposal and methodology that we've used to arrive at this specific code package. So as we started off reviewing our code, once House Bill 3197 was passed, we found that there's pretty significant language included in the Deschutes County Code currently that would not meet the definitional standard for clear and objective. So we've gone through the entirety of both our Title 17, Title 18, Title 19, and Title 22 code to try to essentially audit every portion that we found was not clear and objective or could be found not clear and objective. But we've broken that entire audit down into specific packages in order to make it at least a little bit more digestible. I understand you have like a multi-hundred page packet here tonight, so that's as close as we could actually get to making it digestible. But hopefully the idea is that we'll bring a series of packages together, starting with this one over the next several months in order to get as much of this audit and new amendments across the finish line before that July 1st date. So this first amendment package is going to try to address the following areas. The first and probably most substantive is the definitions associated with the Deschutes County zoning ordinance. That's our Title 18, and the Bend Urban Growth Boundary zoning ordinance. That's our Title 19 areas. The next big piece is the dimensional standards across both Titles 18 and 19. And then finally, the accessory structure standards associated with Titles 18 and 19. I'll go into a lot more detail across each of these individual things now. But generally, our methodology is intended to preserve all existing uses in the code. So we are not removing any land uses that currently exist in the Deschutes County Code. Our goal with this is to go through, remove ambiguous language or things that would not be considered clear and objective, and replace them with either quantitative measurements or a list of options potentially to get them to something that could be considered clear and objective moving forward. There are no policy decisions that we've tried to make where we're deciding that these uses shouldn't be included moving forward. That's what I would encourage the Planning Commission to keep in mind as we move through this. It is intended to be as much as possible an apples to apples change from what exists in the code today to a clear and objective version in the code after passage of these amendments. So now I'll go into the specifics of the amendments, but that is a lot of kind of preamble. So if there are any questions, just methodology and background, I can answer those.
Does any commissioner have a question? Commissioner Hovkamp.
In the methodology, since you just referenced if we had questions on that, under the findings, under methodologies on page 13. But there's a reference, maybe you're going to cover this, to a 2-track system retaining some discretionary review as an alternate track to the clear and objective standards. And are you going to get there? Or I'm just curious how that's going to play out on the ground, whose choice it is, how that applies. How do we go forward with an amended text that's clear and objective, and yet we retain this discretionary?
That's a great question. For the purposes of this particular package, that's not likely to come up. The reason that has been called out is following the approach of similar jurisdictions, including the cities that have gone through this process in the past. We found that many of them have decided, let's say for their goal 5 areas, their natural resource protections. Generally, you can think of preserving the existing language that you have, which can be discretionary. But if you want to preserve that, you also have to offer up a clear and objective pathway. And if you are an applicant looking to develop housing in this particular case, at that initial point that you choose to follow one lane or the other, that's intended to be kind of a track that you either get on. I want to be in my clear and objective lane, in which case you can follow very strict rules and how to meet those standards, or you can elect to move into a discretionary lane if you feel maybe you would have more success or flexibility in following that particular framework moving forward. So there's not a lot that falls into that under this package of amendments, but forthcoming sets of amendments will likely have that kind of 2-track system.
Okay.
Associated.
I'll probably return to the question then, because I'm just wondering, again, if that's going to be unwieldy, either for county staff or navigating it from a user perspective, or, you know, how that's going to be made clear. But I can wait if you prefer that I wait until it's more applicable with you.
Sure. No, it is a great question, and probably will include a learning curve for everybody, applicants and staff included. But the goal is in some ways to provide the flexibility associated with some discretionary standards while also complying with the state rules that require us to have clear and objective standards, ideally.
And Chair,
Yes,
one other possible question, but I'm going to ask Kyle if it's appropriate.
absolutely.
I have a question about definitions, but I know that you're going into the amendments now. Is that the first part of the?
That is the very first part. Yeah.
Okay, I'll hold off then and wait.
Any other questions? All right.
All right. So the first kind of set of these amendments we'll talk about deal with our definitions for both of our zoning codes. Again, our titles 18 and 19 areas. Definitions, and as you can imagine, they're really the foundational principle for everything that we do. We don't define every single term that we use in the code, but specifically for kind of big ideas like what is a dwelling at all, we do define those things. And many of those previous definitions that we had some ambiguous language that could be construed as not being clear and objective. And thus we've tried to go through the entirety of the code, find those terms that could have some overlap with the development of housing, and apply clear and objective filtering through each of those. One of the big things that comes up, the example that I point out here, is what constitutes a family. I'm sure everyone's heard the term single family dwelling. That gets thrown around quite a lot. Family is not a particularly objective term, and thus, for the most part, those types of terms have been removed from the code where possible. So to address all of those ambiguities in our definitions, we tried to adhere to the following methodology. It's got a few different steps. The first is if there was an existing term or a newly included term that we've added into the code that wasn't previously there, that had a statutory definition, so something that's coming from the state level, it's already included in state law, we've adopted that terminology either by reference or verbatim using the exact same language in our local code. The reason we've done that is our understanding in consultation with our legal staff is if language is used in state statute, that language we believe is exempt from the standards, those clear and objective mandates from House Bill 3197. As you can imagine, there are portions of state law and state codes that you could say are not clear and objective. However, there are some kind of foundational bedrock principles that it's hard to get away from when you're looking at that language. And so where possible, we've relied on this statutory framework.
Kyle, and if I could ask you just to talk a little closer to the speaker, it'd be easier for the recording. Thank you.
Of course.
Mr. Williams. This is exactly this, at this point, the question I have about definitions. Would you entertain, although it's interrupting this flow, if I ask Kyle about this? Is that
Sure.
Absolutely.
Sorry about that. Appreciate it. So in the definitions that are defined simply by reference to definitions, various ORSs, just an open question, would our own county code be more complete and useful if those definitions from ORS were incorporated verbatim rather than by reference? And I'm thinking about things like lot, or parcel,
Yeah.
just ORS. Those are pretty key terms. I could understand perhaps why you might not want to do that. If there are changes at the state level that would filter down, we'd have to incorporate those verbatim, in whole definitions. But I'm sure that you guys thought through that, and I'm just curious.
We've had a lot of discussions around this, and it is a little bit of a double-edged sword. In certain cases, generally where we've taken the approach of adopting something verbatim, we tended to limit that to relatively small pieces of text, generally just to make the code more readable to the average user. If you were to pop open the code, you can go to our definition section and say, what is this, X, Y, or Z, and read it outright. For more complicated definitions or things that have various levels, we've tended to adopt that by reference. And generally, we would prefer to adopt almost everything by reference, because one situation that we find ourselves in, if changes do occur at the state level, it's very difficult to constantly keep our code updated as changes come from on high. And then we're forced into a position where, we always do housekeeping amendments, of course, but we generally can only do one, maybe two packages of housekeeping amendments a year. Sometimes we don't even know when things changes at a state level. And so the practice of adopting by reference is in some ways a good policy choice, because it means that we can avoid those future updates to our local code when changes occur at the state level while still maintaining compliance with state statute.
Well, a suggestion for you then.
If you could also speak into your microphone as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. A suggestion for you then, I'm sure you're well ahead of me on this. In the electronic version, the live version of the code, if those ORS references were links, because, again, just from a user perspective, imagining, something as fundamental as parcel or lot, and then having to go and hunt and peck and find an ORSs, but I'm sure there's an impracticality there too, or
It has more to do with the costs of the software that we use to publish the code is the very short answer to a long question. And that's something that we as CDD don't have a lot of control over how that is. We've certainly made that argument, not just for external references, but internal references
Right.
throughout the code as well. It's our hope is that at some point that may happen, but I can't promise that at this point.
Okay, thank you, man. Sorry to pin you down on that.
No, of course. Great questions. So the second possible option, the piece of methodology that we've used in adopting new definitions or proposing new definitions rather, is if there were subjective language in an included definition, so again, things like adequate or designed for, things of that nature, that we could replace with specific measurable standards or explain how to measure something that wasn't previously explained, then those have been included either directly in the definition or elsewhere in the code, pointing to how would you evaluate these things. Height is a very good example, which we'll go a little bit more into later. The third option is if an existing term had multiple criteria which could be interpreted in a few different ways. So, for example, what constitutes a kitchen? What are the components of a kitchen and how would you evaluate that? Then we've included specific directions on how to interpret the standard within the definition itself, or we've added new terms to clarify interdefinition relationships that weren't there previously. To revert back to the kitchen question earlier, we didn't previously define what a kitchen was, and we've moved towards saying this is what a kitchen is from now until either that definition changes at some point in the future or we have new interpretations. The fourth piece is if we had two or more existing terms that provided conflicting interpretations for a very similar standard. The big one that came up is yard versus setback. We use those terms interchangeably. Same is true of something like lot width versus lot depth. Then we've generally simplified those terms into one term to remove unintentional conflicts that had cropped up throughout the code. And then finally, if an existing term had language which had previously been deemed unconstitutional. So earlier I referenced the family discussion in specifically when we're talking about things like a single family dwelling. Previously, our dwelling unit definition was based around familial relationships that had been deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, as well as other courts, lower courts in the past. And so those terms have been modified to remove that offending language and get away from the idea of evaluating, is it a dwelling unit or not, based on those familial relationships. So that's kind of the 5 big pieces of methodology. But obviously, we've had certain terms over the years that have been subject to interpretive challenges, both from staff's perspective as well as applicants. Things like what constitutes a structure. And where possible, we've either attempted to pick the most broad interpretation of those terms that has been used over the years, or if we had a specific interpretation that was chosen by, let's say, a hearings officer or the Board of County Commissioners, then we've selected that particular interpretation and just carried it forward verbatim into the language of the definitions themselves. And then there's some follow on to this, which is, as you can imagine, we use these terms not just in the definition section, but throughout the code. And so there's cascading effects throughout all portions of both titles 18 and 19. And we've essentially had to go through line by line of the entire code and make sure that these new terms didn't diverge from the previous expectation of individual portions of code. We tried to match each of those previous uses to the new uses that are defined now. While maintaining whatever that original intent was as much as possible. There are very few cases where we've essentially had to tweak the standard to get back to the original interpretive issues while using those new terminology frameworks. But again, no uses were removed. Nothing has changed regarding what you can do on your property. It's more just a clarification of how you evaluate what is being done on your property. So that's definitions. That's by far the biggest piece of all this. And if there's any questions before I move on to the next little chunk,
Do any commissioners have a question?
I have
have a question, a few questions about some of the definitions. Should I ask them now or should I wait till you're done with the presentation?
Are they terms that have been addressed yet? Why don't we have you proceed for a little bit? We might get the answers while they come along.
All right, outside of definitions, as I mentioned earlier, the next big piece of this that we've tried to address in this first code package has to do with dimensional standards. So again, these are standards which can be categorized as any criteria which require a specific quantitative measurement. We do this quite a lot in the zoning code. You can think of things like, again, height, setbacks, lot coverage, the floor area of buildings. There's a whole host of these things that pop up. However, even within these particular standards, there was some existing language within the Deschutes County Code that left the application of them relatively ambiguous and open to different interpretations. And again, once you have multiple possible interpretations, it is pretty easy to argue that those standards are not clear and objective. So I figured the easiest way to kind of illustrate this is to provide a specific example, which is how do you measure the height of a structure? I referenced this in our work session, but I think it's interesting given that I posed exactly the same question to our county staff, and you'd be surprised how many different answers you get and how do you measure the height of a structure. So our current definitions, the height of a building means the vertical distance from grade to the highest point of a roof. And grade, you can see there, means the ground level, but it's the average of the finished ground elevation of all walls of a building. And then there's some specific call outs for measuring grade within some of our combining zones, like the landscape management area. But if you try to apply that to an example like this, where maybe you have some complex topography, what is the average grade of a building? Where do you even start measuring from, even if you know what the highest point of the roof is? Do you measure across, do you take 1,000 different measurements across this entire slope? Do you take 5? Do you take 10? Do you take them from multiple angles, the corner of every portion of a building? It's kind of a choose your own adventure. You can really get a lot of different answers in trying to apply this. And it gets even more complex if you really start skewing the topography. If it's on a very, very steep slope, you can imagine that the difference between the bottom of this proposal right here, this kind of hypothetical up to the top of the structure, might wildly throw off what the average grade is if you were looking across that entire slope up to the top. So given that ambiguity, and given that even internally there was conflicts around how we should measure this, we decided that we needed to correct both the definition and how to interpret that definition to provide a single answer moving forward. So our proposed definitions, height would now be changed specifically to pertain just to structures. And it means the vertical distance from the average grade to the highest point of a structure. Grade has now been defined as the elevation of the ground surface. An average grade is specific, again, to calculating structural height. It's just the average of 2 points, which will be the highest finished grade abutting the structure and the lowest finished grade abutting the structure. So in practice, to go back to the previous hypothetical example, what we would do is take the lowest elevation of the structure, the highest elevation abutting the structure. That gives you an average ground elevation. And then you take that average ground elevation up to the highest point of the structure, and that is the height of your building. That falls below 30 feet in most instances. That tends to be our height limit across the county. Then you're good to go. Is there a question, Commissioner Cyrus?
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I might.
Cyrus?
Yeah, what about something that has, for example, a daylight basement that has a short elevation on 3 sides, but then one deeper elevation? Do you count the 4 different ones or just the 2?
So again, you would take whatever the lowest elevation is, the lowest ground elevation directly abutting the structure, whatever that lowest number is. You take the highest number abutting the structure, you average those 2 numbers together to come up with an average ground elevation, and then you measure that to the tallest point of the structure, whatever that happens to be.
Okay, thanks.
So again, that was our approach to kind of normalize the standard that you can imagine has a lot of different possible interpretations, and thus we determined it was likely not clear and objective moving forward, and we wanted to not only to comply with House Bill 3197, but also to provide consistency across both our staff as well as applicants coming in to apply for any type of housing development. We added in some additional definitions for things like finish grade and existing grade to cover all possible options that weren't even outside of measuring heights. And then there are likely to be some specific height measurements associated with the landscape management combining zone. We do have different height measurements in that, but we've broken apart our Goal 5 resource package into a completely different thing, not associated with this current package that you're reviewing here tonight. But I just wanted to make a note that that is forthcoming, some specific discussions around how to measure height within the landscape management combining zone. I know that was a relatively rapid.
Commissioner Count, do you have questions on definitions now?
Apologize, I was not at the last meeting, but I've watched the recording twice to make sure
Yeah.
this is not a repeat question. And I've obviously read the package. So a couple of my questions are regarding definitions. One of them would be kitchen, and it's on page 39, and it includes, it calls it an enclosable area.
Yeah.
And I was just a little like, I just kept coming back to that because modern kitchens are not enclosed anymore. And so I didn't know why that term was used.
That's a great question. And it is, before I even go into the specifics of this, I will note that even at this point, some of these terms are being tweaked around the edges. I would say as we have additional discussion with departments like our building safety staff, some of our permit technicians that deal with explaining these terms to customers on a day-to-day basis. And so it is likely to even arrive at a slightly different version, although the intent is ultimately going to remain the same across all these terms.
Okay.
The reason we chose enclosable follows sort of two paths. One is a normal kitchen in a house is an enclosable area because it's in a house. It's inside of a building. That we would say is an enclosable area. You can shut the doors. It is enclosed. However, as time has gone on, more modern home designs have started to expand the idea of what would be a kitchen even into either fully outdoor or semi-outdoor areas. And there was a question of, do we want to qualify those areas as kitchens as well, as we start to see these more complicated and complex requests for indoor outdoor dining, things of that nature. And that felt as close as we could possibly get to covering all possible bases if we've seen lots of these different designs come up.
Well,
Good evening, your planning manager, Will Groves. There's also a very specific example that came up a couple times that we had in mind. So someone would come to us and they'd say, hey, we want essentially a duplex. We want to have two discrete dwelling units here, each with their own kitchen. And we said, you're not allowed to have that in the zone. And they said, what if the other one was serviced by an outdoor kitchen? We said, no, you can't have it with well, I don't know. People have barbecues. They have things like that. You know, they might have even grill tops outside that have a sink in association with them as part of kind of an outdoor cooking scenario. We said, yeah, we don't think we regulate outdoor cooking areas. So if you had, a primary kitchen, but you also had some sort of, out by the pool, some sort of grill with a sink that starts to look a lot like a kitchen, we'd say, fine. And they said, what if we put it right next to the house and had it so we could pull a garage door down so it was open to the air? And that's not a second kitchen, is it? And we said, we think it is. So this was this is a perfect example of people being very creative. So by enclosable, if you can enclose it, it thus is indoors and thus is a kitchen if it looks like a kitchen. So there's a very specific example that happened 3 or 4 times where people were trying to work their way around to, essentially a duplex. And all of a sudden there's a garage door on an outdoor kitchen. So trying to let people know, trying to be clear in the code, like, hey, that's another kitchen in that scenario.
Okay, that makes sense. It is a little like that word just kept popping out like.
Yeah, if you've got a better one, we're game for it.
About it and
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah. We did a lot of workshopping and nobody loves that word. And at the same time, we're not sure how to be clear about that. Yeah, if you can't, it doesn't have to be closed in, but if you can close it,
interior?
Yeah, they argued that the garage door made it not interior. And it was plainly conditioned space. The idea was that the garage door was going to close and maybe never open again. So, some interesting examples. We're trying to parse out the difference between one thing and another. Well, because we don't mean to preclude if somebody had, a sink and a gas grill out by the pool, that would definitionally, as you start to add facilities to it, that would start to drift to kitchen. And, we plainly don't want to get we don't want to get in the business of regulating that. And I don't think anybody's going to try to run a duplex year round with an outdoor kitchen as the basis for cooking. So that's how we split it. But again, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can see a little bit. I'm showing you kind of how the sausage is made here at the outdoor kitchen.
Unintended.
Yeah, pun intended. And and this is in part why we're having this hearing. This is really purely a technical exercise. I don't think we'd be digging in. But if you see a definition, you're like, how does that work, or why is it like that, or could it be some other way? We've generally kicked them around pretty hard, and at the same time, even to this day, the kitchen definition, we're still kind of moving around a little bit on to try to catch the right circumstances. Wet bar is a particularly tough one because wet bar starts a lot to look like that, you could operate a duplex with a wet bar, and a lot of people have wet bars. And so how do we make sure that we're not over regulating those we're working our way through that balance in particular.
Have we asked Chat GPT what a kitchen might be?
Absolutely. And it's as confused as we are.
Yeah, I'm going to keep going with the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
Because then it goes on to say, I just kind of screenshot, so I'm kind of trying to, it says, food that includes any of the following, and it goes through, a list of items, and then it has microwave and any food heating appliance. And I was a little caught off that because if I plug a microwave in my office, is that now considered a kitchen? I know I'm being a little, but I'm just kind of like trying to be that person.
So I'll give you something of a peek behind the curtain. So this is one of those terms that we've had numerous, even since our work session before the holidays. We've tweaked the kitchen definition even further, and the most current definition that is likely the one that we would carry forward to the board essentially breaks down to: is it a sink outside of a bathroom with any food heating appliance? Those two things together, we have fallen on. That probably is the broadest possible interpretation of what a kitchen is. So again, sink outside of a bathroom, any food heating appliance, microwave, coffee pot, toaster oven.
A combo of the two.
Combo of the two is
That makes sense to me. It's my living to go through house. I go through hundreds of houses a year, and you see so many times, and I don't think the term's correct, but like a mother-in-law suite. So where there's like two primary bedrooms in a home, and maybe there's a mother-in-law living in one of them. And there often is an appliance plugged in where they could heat, or a coffee pot, or, and so it kind of lends to an auxiliary kitchen. But it all is removable? Kind of my idea is like with a kitchen is, are the appliances removable? Then it's not a kitchen. So I'm just in my mind kind of.
Oh, you're doing great.
doing
We've
exactly what we
Okay.
spent most of our career,
Yeah.
at least once a week, going through this exercise. Because if you think about at the broadest level, what the state land use system is trying to do is it's trying to increase density in cities and hold density at kind of constant in rural areas. And one of the ways you do that is that you try to prevent people from creating duplexes, ADUs, multiplexes out in the rural lands. And typically the way that you do that is that you create independent living facilities. So, as soon as you've got kind of a bed, bath, kitchen trinity, you could rent that to somebody separately. And, and that might be occupied by a good number of people. And so the state's tried to control that with kind of the way that something's constructed. So facilities, I'd say, and also with that definition of family. And it's like, okay, we're not going to tell you how many people can be here, but I guess if you're all kin, we're going to not patrol that, and that produces some good results and some weird results too. So this new paradigm that we're moving towards is trying to give people a clearer notion of what's obliged of them. So for certain types of facilities, we're going to say, just go ahead. You know, if you want to have, if there's, you know, for example, if there's just a sink by itself, like you have a laundry tub, we're not going to pay out. We don't think somebody's going to start having a second house because they've got a laundry tub. When you see like, you know, a sink plus a refrigerator, and we start to see a couple of these facilities paired, we're going to what's called a restrictive covenant. Where as you get your building permit, you sign and you say, hey, I know this is one house and everybody has to live together in it. It's not sellable or rentable in separate subparts. You know, we let people, so that gets you to things like wet bars, for example, that might turn into a duplex. And the notion is that both you and your successors and heirs and assigns are aware of what the limitations are. And, you know, if you show up on Craigslist renting it as a duplex and our software catches it, we can go out there and say, hey, you had a good reason to know because either you signed this or it was on your title when you got it. As you move towards having clusters of these facilities, sometimes you have these things. So let's say I'm a potter, you know, so I might have, you know, a kiln, 220 wiring, a microwave, a double basin sink in an area. And in those cases, you would go into a land use process. You'd say, hey, I recognize that this looks like it could be a second kitchen, but it's not. Here's what I'm doing with it. This is allowed in the zone. And we issue a decision that says, yeah, that's fine. That's a thing that happens at a house and you're not, the purpose isn't to establish a second kitchen. Proceed. Or you might have a home occupation. You might have a scenario where you make salsa in your house and you have a second commercial kitchen because that's subject to different hygiene standards. And in that case, you would have a land use approval that says, look, you know, don't be renting this part out separately and enjoy making salsa. So right now, every time that something comes up, we end up scratching our heads, you know, if this is a duplex now, the code's really pretty ambiguous. And under the new scenario, what I'd say is we're moving towards, and we're exploring this as we go, and, you know, will continue to be resolved before the board. We're exploring what I call less prior restraint, less telling people you can't build that, you know, you can't have a sink that's more than 18 inches diagonal because, you know, that's more than a wet bar. Or there's, you know, like you can't have so less prior restraint structurally and more, hey, you know, that you're like what your rights and obligations are here. You signed that. Okay. And, you know, also a notion that, you know, overwhelmingly, you know, that, you know, to the extent that these things drift out of compliance, generally nobody, like nothing horrific's going to happen. You know, if it turns out that one of these things ends up being split into a duplex and rented out, if we get called, we know what to do about it. It's a very clear legal situation that was well noticed to everyone. And kind of the downside of having multiple people live in that structure, it's like, well, you know, if you've got 4 people who are living as a family in a structure, and then you've got 2 pairs of 2 who are living with separate kitchens, you know, the impacts, you know, the risk doesn't seem tremendous, especially as the state drifts towards allowing RVs as rental dwellings, ADUs, other scenarios where that boundary of you get one house in the rural area seems to be drifting a little bit. We're moving towards maybe less prior structural restraint and more letting people know what their rights and obligations are and sign off on that rather than tell them what they can build and not. And it drives, frankly, it's really difficult for our inspectors because, you know, somebody has got a wet bar and they've gone and cut a hole in their marble countertop and, you know, they bought a particular sink for it and it's the wrong size and they didn't realize that there was a sink limitation because it's buried in some, you know, land use regulation. So trying to be less prescriptive, although a lot of jurisdictions take it this way. They're like, a wet bar is an area that has a sink that, you know, is no more than 18 inches on the diagonal. And the trap arm that receives the water from the basin of the sink is no more than X inches and, you know, of this, and really get very prescriptive. And that's hard for the building folks to monitor, patrol, and it's confusing to people too. So we're trying an approach here. And again, you're going to see this continue to be in motion. So what we've got before you today is a draft at a time and place to get your feedback on. And, you know, as we come before the board, they'll say, hey, we kept moving kitchen because we weren't satisfied, at least for our purposes, where it landed. PC had some feedback on these terms. Here's what they said. Here's where we are now. What do you think, board? So you'll see kind of an ongoing evolution, especially you'll see this feedback loop between what's allowed in accessory building and what's defined as a kitchen. You know, you can have an accessory building, for example, like if I'm a farmer, let's say that I'm in the MUA 10 zone, I'm engaging in a farm activity and I have a horse barn and out there I have, you know, a bath because, you know, a shower because, you know, when I get in from riding, my spouse isn't going to let me in the house the way I am. And so, you know, I'm going to bathe out there. I'm going to maybe I'm washing my tack in the washable part of tack in a washing machine. And all of a sudden that looks a lot like an apartment, you know. At the same time, the next person who buys it might think, perfect, it's an apartment. And then they buy it in good faith. They're counting on grandma's social security check to pay the mortgage, and the neighbors call, not even to complain. They call and they'd be like, hey, neighbors have this amazing apartment. How do we get one? And all of a sudden, you know, the people who bought the house, the realtor said, this is an ADU. And, you know, so then all of a sudden our lobby's full of lawyers. And so really, I mean, Clear and Objective, back to the core of what we're doing, is trying to help people understand what their rights and obligations are and set their expectations right. And also preserve as much ability to, you know, when there's ambiguity, trust people, you know, when there's not a real harm from not doing that.
I'll say this is all good discussion, and this is literally the very next thing that I was going to talk about, which is probably one of the core pieces that's a part of this package. I mean, obviously we've talked about definitions and dimensional standards, but one of the biggest things that we've had to account for in all this is what is a dwelling unit and what is not a dwelling unit, and how do you distinguish those two? So almost everything that Will has just pointed out here is, when we're talking about dwelling units, usually we're talking about kitchens. That tends to be interrelated to all that, which is why we've had to spend so much time drafting and redrafting what is a kitchen. And then there are these kind of in-between intermediary things that start to look like kitchens. And so we've tried to come up with very specific scenarios where you can do this, you can't do this. If you do this, you can do this if you record this document. If you want to do this, then you can go through a land use process and specifically catalog, yes, I want this thing that looks an awful lot like a kitchen, but I'm not going to use it as a kitchen. Or if I'm going to use it as a kitchen, I'm not going to use the kitchen as a part of a dwelling unit. So if you had a home occupation and the salsa making example, so you actually do need a kitchen, but you're not going to live in the place where the kitchen might be located.
Yeah, just from my personal experience, what you're saying, Will, it's not necessarily the creator of the use, it's the second user that
Correct.
usually they're, and you're right, the keyword is expectations are different than what, you know, code is, because it looks like an apartment. And so I think that I love that you're, you know, trying to really create disclosures, because you're right. Not everyone does due diligence when at times of sale, because they're so excited and, you know, all the things, or they're just with an experienced person is helping them. And so I think that's really anything you can do. I'm really grateful for that, because it disappoints people
Yeah.
and it frustrates them. And then they blame the county,
Mhm.
and then you're the bad guy.
Yeah, how
And it's
how was
not
I supposed to
correct.
know? Yeah, exactly. And so the big shift here is an increasing reliance on title facing documents. So we ask people to record things to the title, because what we found is that even very reasonable people aren't going to open up, you know, the dial.deschutes.org and dig into the documents and read page 38 of a decision that explains that, you know, that this kitchen isn't what you think it is.
Thank you for.
Hmm.
I had
Madam Chair. Oh, go
another
ahead.
definitions question.
Does this question, Commissioner Cyrus, pertain to this specific?
No, different topic. I
Okay.
thought you were done.
And then I do have one question before you have your definition. So you do ask the homeowner or applicant who has installed the industrial grade kitchen to put it into title, but it's not required by county to be put onto title.
So that's a great question. And I could explain it how we approach this now, and then the goal for how we would like to see this if all these definitions and various other portions are adopted. So right now, generally what we see is if you come in as applicant, you go up to the front counter and you say, I want to build XYZ. I want to build an accessory structure. Depending on what zone you're in, you're usually directed to planning as a very first step. Planning says, what are you looking to do? They say, I want to build a detached shop building. And we say, great, you're allowed to do that in the zone. It's usually not until much later, when actual plans have been developed and we can see what is going to be inside the structure, that we say, This accessory structure is starting to look an awful lot like a dwelling. You've got spaces for 220 wiring here. You've got like framed out areas for kitchen appliances. All this stuff is going in this accessory building. It's very difficult for us with a straight face to say, are you truly going to tell us that this is not a dwelling? Very often at that point is when frustration starts, both on the part of staff as well as the applicants, where we're saying, look, we need some guarantee that you understand your rights and obligations, which is typically the approach that we've pursued over previous years. As we say, if you record a document that we call a restrictive covenant document, it basically says in very simple, relatively simple legal language, you can have one dwelling on this property. This structure cannot be used as a dwelling. Sign that, record it to the title, and away you go. You can build exactly what you told us you were going to build. There are more complicated situations where maybe we would say, this is actually something that you need to tell us exactly what the proposed use is. We might make you go through a land use process. So in the case of something like a home occupation, that's one of the more common things that we do. You say, I want to run a home business that's going to have a kitchen in it. You tell us the full extent of what that business looks like. There are limitations that a lot of them come from state law and how to run a home occupation. We send out a notice land use decision to all your neighbors. Everybody gets to comment. If it's approved, it's not appealed by anybody and it passes through, then you can run that business. But again, that is a document that is recorded with the property so that we understand the full extent of what is allowed on site. What we would like to move to is to remove that intermediary portion between when you tell us what you're going to build and getting us the specific plans. So if you come up to planning, let's say all this is passed, and somebody says, I want to build an accessory structure, we say, great, this is what is allowed in an accessory structure. These are the things you can have in there. If you want to go above and beyond that, there's possible pathways, and then there's some things you just can't do at all. That's the ideal.
So is the covenant mandated? Do you require proof of the covenant being filed or the restrictive?
Current scenario, we don't have actually the ability to impose anybody recording the covenant. So we've done a little strong arming. We've said, look, the use that you propose doesn't appear to be allowed in the zone. And so you can go through a land use process, which is going to cost $1,500 and take 6 months or 3 to 6 months. And we don't know how it's going to turn out. If on the alternative, you volunteer to record this covenant that says you understand that it's not a dwelling, we can all walk away from this. And that's the way that we've kind of duct tape and chicken wired our way through this for the past decade. And now under the current draft of the code, it specifies in these circumstances you record a covenant, and in these circumstances you go to land use. And it can be really tough because, I mean, if you imagine, I'm going to present myself as a character here. You know, I'm going to move in with my in-law needs to move in with me, who maybe I don't love tremendously, but I recognize needs help. And ideally, they would be on the very far end of the property in their own ADU, but that's not something I can either afford to construct, or maybe it's not allowed in the zone. So my second idea is like, well, can we build a brick wall down the middle of the house and put them in the other side, and we'll never eat dinner together? And we definitely see that. And that causes planning to say, no, you've made a duplex at that point. And they said, well, what if there's a door in the brick wall? Can we just lock it? And then it's like, and it's like, you know, you said I can't have a kitchen. Can I have this sink and a countertop? And then as soon as you turn your back, can I put in an induction, you know, cook's top and a convection oven and a microwave and one of those portable laundry tubs and things like that? And we're like, look, if you write yoga room and or man cave on there, or wet bar, and sign a thing that you know that it's one house, you know, that's as far as we're going to pursue that. So you see a lot of scenarios where multi-generational living, people are trying to live as far away from each other as they legally can. And we spend a lot of time negotiating with people. They say, well, you know, like a lot of times you'll have immediately on the same side of a wall a different washer and dryer for the two different sides of the household. And our current code says you're supposed to be living together in a housekeeping unit. So initially we said, well, maybe you're supposed to have one washer and dryer. And then we see in these larger houses, you know, that people have multiple washers and dryers, or they have it for their TAC or for they have separate stuff like that. So that didn't turn out to be a good boundary to patrol in terms of, is somebody creating a duplex? So we see a lot of ambiguity and a lot of kind of frustration, especially when people paid for plans. They're like, hey, I thought I knew what the deal was, had my architect draw something up, I'm tens of thousands of dollars into a plan, and now you're telling me I can't build it this way. So this is really, again, the core of the Clear and Objective project, is to make it easier for people to see where they're going. And we're being very careful, and I think we've succeeded to date in not changing the deal. So the places that you could end up in the code now, you can still end up there. It's just a lot clearer what lane you're in from the outset.
That leads to, you mentioned it, May, housekeeping unit. I saw that several times, and then I went to go look for a definition because I was like, what is a housekeeping unit? And I never found a definition. And I was kind of curious why you use those terms in those two places, and I didn't really know what it meant.
So another peek behind the curtain here. This is another one of those dwelling unit and kitchen, I would say, are the two things that are likely going to be tweaked right up until the 11th hour, so to speak. Housekeeping unit originally was pulled in because we previously used that language. When we're talking about what a family was. A family was previously defined. Our most recent, as of this week, essentially, version removed housekeeping unit entirely. It's just 4 more persons. That's it.
So housekeeping unit has been stricken.
It's gone.
Commissioner Cyrus.
A similar question. I've noticed on pages 33, 34, in the area where they're talking about flood, everything else except floodplain. Is there a definition for a floodplain somewhere?
There is a definition for a floodplain. Maybe you want to talk.
Yeah, I'm the
Yeah, I was like,
Hi, Will Groves, your floodplain manager. So at the beginning of chapter 1896, it explains that it's those areas shown as special flood hazard areas on a particular year iteration of a map. So it's not something that's basically the code, it's back in the code because it says, please reference these maps to see what areas are the special flood hazard areas and thus subject to it. It's unlike our wetlands definition says a wetland is this. And then the maps say, here's some examples of that. The floodplain, it says, here is a map of the floodplain, and that is the floodplain. We're not going to tell, there's not a kind of a first principles thing that we're going to tell you that a floodplain is an area that has a, statistical probability of the 2% inundation, something like that. So it doesn't come out of, it comes out of, we have received a map and those maps are dated and here's the reference to that. So
I was just, because under fill and removal, for example, it talks about, things you can do in all these areas, including a floodplain.
mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking maybe even for the definition, you stick a floodplain that says pursuant to XYZ map identified by.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking, okay, so how do I know what I can do in these areas and how do I know where the floodplain is if it doesn't tell me?
That's a great question. And a lot of these definitions, so, and I was going to talk to this more at the end, we have different modules of Clear and Objective, and and as I've been calling out through kind of our entire process here, and sort of the most daunting part of this is our Goal 5 inventories, our protection of either scenic resources, wildlife resources, fill and removal in wetlands and floodplains, dealing with kind of things that we've generally said, it's hard to tell if this is a good idea or a bad idea. Let's get a biologist and a hydrologist together and think about it. And boy, is that not clear and objective. So, you'll see as we come into these future modules, we'll be struggling with just these questions too. So recognize that, that these definitions are things that apply to almost every project are the ones that we're doing, and that you'll see things that are specific to wildlife areas or floodplains or wetlands, that you'll see that a lot of motion associated with that in another module. But I don't know, the point that you're making hasn't been addressed to date, and I think it's a good one.
any other?
Commissioner Kelly, any more questions right now?
I mean, they might come up as of now in my notes.
Alrighty. Thank you. Kyle?
Yeah, I'll try to go through this last piece relatively quickly here, since we've covered a lot of this in the last 10, 15 minutes. So as I pointed out, one of the last big pieces of this is trying to distinguish what's a dwelling unit, what is not a dwelling unit, what are allowed in those specific uses. So As we've just talked about, almost all zones, our R10 zones, MUA10 zones, for example, only allow the establishment of a single dwelling unit on a particular piece of property. That doesn't include things like ADUs, which obviously we passed relatively recently. But under most circumstances, you have one property, you can get one dwelling. That tends to be the deal outside of the incorporated cities in essentially everywhere in the state of Oregon. This tends to be one of the biggest conflict issues that we see over time, again, because of creative development situations, creative designs for structures, and how people are choosing to live together more and more. And so we're trying to balance, obviously, the concerns that family members might have, intergenerational living, things of that nature, along with the fact that we do have some state land use rules that prohibit the establishment of multiple dwellings on most properties. And so it's relatively challenging to implement portions of our code when we're looking at these kind of definitional gray areas. So things like wet bars, for example, are once you start adding cooking facilities into a detached yoga studio or a shop building or whatever that happens to be. And so we get a lot of different applications for specifically those types of developments. And what we've tried to do is, again, clarify very specific lanes that people fall into in determining this is what I'm allowed to have in a dwelling unit, this is what I'm allowed to have in an accessory structure, and this is how I can get to some of those in between definitional transition pieces. Again, this covers some of what we just talked about. We've tried to limit those things through land use decisions or recording these restrictive covenant documents that we've talked about. And as Commissioner Kelly pointed out, really it is twofold, the recording of those documents, both to alert the current property owner that, yes, you're acknowledging that these are the standards that apply to your property at this point in time, but more importantly, in some ways, to alert future property owners if they buy that and they misinterpret the design of a particular structure and say, oh, I bought a property with two houses on it. I'm going to maximize that to my benefit, even if it was established unlawfully or was never intended to be used as that particular setup. So the proposed amendments that we have here today, this is again in flux, but generally it outlines what components constitute a dwelling unit. And as we pointed out here, that's for the most part, it's going to be kitchens. That's probably the biggest piece. Full bath. And then the last big piece is internal accessibility. So the way that our most current version of a dwelling unit is essentially it's 4 or more persons. They're living together. Housekeeping unit is gone. You have one kitchen. You have at least one full bath. And all areas are shared in common with the exception of bedrooms, but you have to have internal access to all areas of the dwelling unit. So even if you have, let's say, another room tacked on that you can only access from the outside of the structure, it's essentially a duplex in some regards, that would not be allowed under this particular definition. That starts to move outside of the boundaries of what would be considered a dwelling unit. Some of those components, again, we further defined in the Deschutes County Code where they didn't previously have definitions. Kitchen's a great example. Baths and full baths, we've also further defined in places where we needed that additional clarification. The next piece of this is identifying what components you can have in an accessory structure, and then establishing formal process to ensure that any of those accessory structures aren't unlawfully converted to or otherwise used for dwelling unit purposes. So again, our to-date current version of this looks like we've identified what you can have in a dwelling unit. If you want to build an accessory structure, you can have certain things into detached accessory structures. You can have certain things in portions of an attachment to your dwelling unit. So an attached garage is generally what we've been thinking about. In a detached accessory structure, the way it should function and the way we've hopefully designed it to function is you can have either a full bath, you can have a sink in combination with something like a laundry tub is a good example. You can have a sink in combination with a washer dryer. You can have a sink in combination with a refrigerator, but you can't have any type of cooking facilities. That is the kind of clearest cut example. And if you want any of those specific combinations of things, let's say you wanted a sink in combination with a refrigerator in a detached garage, you could do that, but you would need to record a restrictive covenant document that says this is starting to tiptoe towards dwelling unit. You're not having to pay any money to the community development department in this case, but you do have to acknowledge, yep, this looks a lot like a dwelling, not a dwelling. That gets recorded to the title for this particular property. More complicated setups. So again, let's say you did want a kitchen in a detached accessory structure. You're not fully prohibited from doing that, but you would have to go through a formal land use process where you explicitly outline, this is why I need the kitchen. I'm doing it for this purpose. It's still not going to be a dwelling unit, but you give all the characteristics of what you need it for. Home occupations are probably the most common example we might see. Let's say you're running a home bakery and you need 5 ovens in your detached garage on a different part of your property. You can do that provided you go through a land use process and we record under these conditions, you can pursue that use.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So could you, let's say I purchase a home, and there was this combo of pre-kitchen accessories in a room, and I buy it, and the person before did not record the, could I come in and, I start asking these questions, I'm all excited. And they're like, hey, cool your jets. This actually isn't allowed, but you can you then record the document, even though you weren't the person that put in those?
So that's a tricky question. It's hard to give a formal answer because generally, I think what you're saying is, could I retroactively
Exactly.
approve this? I think it's going to depend on 2 things. It would depend specifically on, is that use allowed at all? Like maybe it's a fully illegal thing that you've then uncovered to us. In that case, it may be a situation where you're then having to decommission that. In the worst possible scenario, you're having to decommission whatever the use is. But if you're not specifically requesting, let's say, a building permit from us, let's say you have a laundry facilities and a fridge and a sink in your garage, and that was all established before you bought the property. But if you're not proposing anything from us, you don't need electrical permits or building permits or whatever it happens to be. There's no real reason for us to require you to record the document. We don't have any leverage at that point because we're not doing a specific review. We're just answering questions. We might suggest that you want to record that document for the sake of future property owners. But we're not withholding anything from you for not doing that.
Where my mind is if the goal is to educate future or disclose to future homeowners that this is a non-conforming use or a do not treat this as a second dwelling, wouldn't it be a good idea to then record this situation on the deed so that future?
That's a great question.
That's kind of that's why I asked the question.
From a purely educational standpoint, you're right. Generally, everything that we're talking about here, most of the time, we are our hitch when we can require anything, whether that's a land use decision or a restrictive covenant, is when a development is being proposed. If you are not proposing a development, then you can ask us as many questions as you want and walk out the door. And if you haven't submitted anything, then we're not reviewing anything. And that is essentially where the line is drawn between what we care about and what we can do anything about. Does that help answer?
Yeah, I'm just kind of just thinking if the goal is to maybe
We certainly would tell that particular
Yeah.
in your hypothetical example, if you came and asked us these questions, we'd certainly relay that information to you, but we couldn't force you to record
Gotcha.
a particular document. All right. So that's the full formal, whoop, my computer just died. We have received 1 comment to date, I will say, on this proposal. That came earlier this morning from Central Oregon Land Watch. Central Oregon Land Watch specifically requested that they had concerns over the inclusion of 1 term in our Title 18 and Title 19 areas. That was the inclusion of the new term incidental and subordinate. We use that term quite a lot throughout our land use proceedings, generally to describe someone who is pursuing a use that is not intended to supersede the primary use on site. We've used this example a lot, but something like a home occupation is a good example. So under certain conditions, you're allowed to run a business outside in your dwelling or in certain accessory structures on site, but you cannot turn your entire residential property into a commercial operation on site. So that would mean that the business in this case is incidental and subordinate. That language also gets used a lot in terms of state statute regarding farm uses, particularly in agricultural uses in EFU lands. And Land Watch's concerns specifically wanted to ensure that we weren't somehow superseding those statutory requirements by the inclusion of this new term. It's a reasonable thing to raise, and we acknowledge it and generally agree with the approach. But maybe an hour before walking into this meeting, we had some conversations with our legal counsel. I think our goal was to add a new piece of language into both of our definition sections for the zoning code, which just calls out that if there's statute that has a specific definition language, then that state statute rules over what our local code is. We think that it would be the case anyway without the inclusion of this language, but it just makes everything above board that people know if we use a particular term in our local code that has an existing state definition that somehow should override over that, then the state code in that case would be what we use moving forward. No agency comments to date. And with that's the end of my presentation. Just to round out that, commissioners obviously have a few different options here. You can leave the record open. We'll take testimony, et cetera, at the end of all this. You can leave the written record open to a certain time and date. You can close the written record and commence deliberations at a specified time and date, or you could commence deliberations here tonight if and when there's any additional testimony that's heard.
Do any commissioners have any other questions?
There, it's appropriate, given that the hearing's open. But I do have one question. It's really brief.
Does it pertain to what Kyle has presented? Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Nunzi. In the chapter, it's 18.120 on exceptions. There's one of the substantive pieces there. It's a little bit more extensive with the new language is 18.120.030, and it's on pages 510 to 511 in our packet, and it's has to do with setbacks. So again, it's 18.120.030. Exceptions to and yard is stricken and it's now setback requirements. So agree with the clear and objective substitution of setback for yard, but I'm probably not reading this right, but in the language in that subsection, there are a lot of exceptions that refine setback requirements. And I'll just, I guess just generally, I wanted to ask what your team, what your thinking was on some of the construction of those exceptions, setback requirements, but more specifically, for instance, let's see, there's a point C there. It's actually C5 that C says the following features are not subject to front, rear, or side setbacks. And under 5, it's outdoor improvements at finished grade, including but not limited to paved areas, driveways, or walkways. So I'm sure, again, I'm probably not reading this right, but would that imply that a driveway could be property line tight in a rural area?
It can, and it can under the existing code.
Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, for our purposes, driveways are not structures subject to setbacks. And the same is true of, again, with all of the amendments proposed here, we're trying not to remove or change any of the rules as they are in place. The same is true of like if you had a paver patio that under
Right.
under most circumstances.
Those can be property line tight.
Those can also be property line type.
Why the extent of the exceptions under setbacks? Is it because there's all of these things that aren't really, or that are quasi-structural but at grade? Is that the reason why, or?
That is generally why, yeah. So there's things that might be they are construed, and we would construe them as developments, but they may not actually be structures that need to be subject to setbacks. Setbacks obviously have a few different purposes. A lot of it has to do with fire life safety,
Yeah.
the spacing between individual structures. That's a big portion of it. Some of it has to do with things like traffic sighting distances. You can imagine we have front yard setbacks specifically because you want to be able to see as you're pulling out onto a particular roadway, and things that are at grade, like a driveway, are typically not going to impose on those standards that we would anticipate with setbacks.
Okay, well, fair enough. And I know that it was not the intent of this packet of language amendments. It was the intent to conform with state law of clear and objective, and it wasn't the intent to tweak policy. That might be something I'd be interested in visiting down the road. Full disclosure, I had a neighbor one time build a new driveway property line tight to my property in Bend, and I kind of resented it. And he just sort of parked a bunch of derelict vehicles along there for me to enjoy right at the property line. But that it seems like that might be something I don't know, might want to look at some point.
Madam Chair, if I may, Peter Gutowski, Community Development Director. All excellent points, Commissioner Hovkamp. One aspect that I think is worth underscoring that is different than you would find in a urban environment with very tight lots is every dwelling, even when we have every new dwelling, and when we have major improvements to existing dwellings, there's an obligation to make sure we have a driveway access permit. And so when you think of a new home on a rural lot, typically that driveway access permit, I mean, obviously there's multitude of factors, but that driveway access permit is pretty much going to be in the middle of the property. You can have the vision clearance that Kyle was talking about. Now, topography,
it can meander, right? It
could meander, sure. I'm not saying it's always true dead center, but the fact that we are looking at sight lines and the road, this is in collaboration with the road department. Unless you're getting into really dense rural subdivisions, Deschutes River Woods, with Commissioner Williams, Chair Williams, there's some denser residential developments in southern Deschutes County. You could get those driveway access permits, that get closer to the property line. But all things being equal, the rural lotting pattern, I think, it makes it less likely than what you would find in an urban environment where you've got those pavers and driveways literally, at the front property line where you're sharing it with your neighbor.
Okay. Yep. Fair enough.
Just to clarify though, it is the case now that there's no zoning restrictions in terms of setback distances that are associated with driveways.
Yeah, and I can imagine again, and not it's respecting the hour, but I was talking about an experience where there was an existing apron, an existing driveway, and the neighbor just decided, I want this accessory kind of little driveway going around to the side, and built it property line tight. But that's my personal grievance. Thanks for entertaining it.
Yeah, of course.
So I've only got a dozen more particular points. I don't have any other. That's it.
Commissioners? And do we have any, yes, Commissioner Stockkamp?
I just have one general question for clear and objective standards. Can I ask that?
Absolutely.
What's the measurable data for the county or like the state of Oregon too? Because I know it's the date they're trying to get it by is July 1 this year. So with it being for all the clear and objective standards outside of urban growth boundaries now, is there measurable data like efficiency and everything that they're trying to see what the positive impact's going to be? Because there's got to be a reason behind it all. So I'm just curious how it's going to be measured.
To my knowledge, there is no specific measurable data. I mean, I'm sure they have like housing production targets at a state level. I don't know that they believe that by changing these passing these state provisions that we expect X 10,000 more dwelling units to come out of this. Peter may have more information. I will say though that the general goal of passing these is to expedite the production of housing and remove obstacles. That is, if we have clear and objective standards, the idea is that if you are a homeowner, you walk in off the street, you submit an application for a house, and we have clear and objective standards, you should know either before even walking into the building or immediately upon receiving a copy of the development code. Yes, I can build my house in exactly this way, in exactly this location, et cetera. You're not going to be challenged either by different interpretations from staff, other neighboring property owners that you may have. So we have just one set of standards that everyone agrees. These are the rules that we play by.
But Commissioner Stockham, I don't have the year identified precisely or the legislation, but the clear and objective standards came from, as I recall, Governor Kotek, might have been her first year in office, it was a priority. And the clear and objective standards for housing were really targeted for lands within urban growth boundaries, but the language was written poorly. And the genesis of how this why this is applying to counties is there was a lawsuit involving Washington County in their metro boundary outside in the urban and unincorporated area, but within the metro urban boundary. And the long and the short of it is it was appealed. The clear and objective standards for Goal 5 were not met. This was significantly litigated several times. At one point, the Land Use Board of Appeals interpreted that the requirements for clear and objective standards not only applied in urban unincorporated areas within urban growth boundaries, but also to rural areas, all rural areas, including farm and forest land. That then set the advocacy groups on both sides of the spectrum. On one side, the conservation side, they were really, really concerned that this would undermine the protections that have been in place for 50 years in farm and forest lands. On the other hand, property rights association, the building industry saw this as a real opportunity to address a housing need. And so thus was born House Bill 3197 to basically cut a deal. And the deal was that they would strip the clear and objective standards from resource zone property. And in areas that Kyle has pointed out, or unincorporated communities, non-resource lands, exception lands, clear and objective standards apply. So, I'll be honest, Deschutes County, the board that wasn't necessarily, I think they were largely neutral, but for the 36 counties, there was a lot of concern about this being an unfunded mandate and really trying to scale it back to what we all thought was the original intent, which is where most of our housing is built, is right. It's within urban growth boundaries. Those comments and arguments were not persuasive. And as fate would have it, the Land Use Board of Appeals had there was another land use case that was brought to their attention, I recall, was in Lane County. Someone was trying to apply clear and objective standards to farm and forest. This is before House Bill 3197 was enrolled, was promulgated, and LUBA clarified that their intent all along at the Washington County case was for it to apply to urban growth boundaries. But by then it was too late. House Bill 3197 was enacted into law. And so this is a long-winded question. I think there's a lot of expectation that there's going to be expedited housing. Now you can't discriminate in cities. You can't discriminate between duplexes and triplexes. I mean, maybe think multifamily. You really have to have clear and objective standards there. So I think there's a hope that housing production will increase significantly in cities. For the counties, I think we're just part of a broader agenda, sincerely, to provide increased opportunities for housing that are less litigious in those specific areas.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Cyrus.
follow-up question. Is there anything that says the counties can't apply clear and objective standards and basically expand this process to include resource lands?
You cannot. The case law is,
Okay,
yeah, LUBA has declared that it's not permissible. Now, Commissioner Cyrus, of course, the legislature could decide that they would like to extend those opportunities, but to date, farm and forest lands are considered intact.
Any other questions, commissioners? And do we have any blue papers today? Blue paper? Public testimony?
Public test.
And I believe, Ms. Gould, we are open for public testimony. Am I correct, Kyle?
Correct. Yep.
All righty.
Questions for me?
I don't believe so.
Thank you. My name is Nunzi Gould. I reside in the county. I also own property in an urban growth boundary in our community. The 489-page text that you're reviewing, have you guys all read that? Have you read through it all? One thing that I've been following is how everybody keeps talking about our needed housing. And I'm not actually seeing a definition in this code for what that actually is. And in the course of the legislative push that the governor has had, I think the intent is to provide housing for those who need the housing, not for the multimillionaires who are paying for housing. And by that, I mean, we should have definitions in our code now for deed restricted housing, senior housing, definitions for housing that relates to an area median income, workforce housing. These are all terms that are showing up within our cities. In particular, the last UGB expansion for the city of Bend, the 100 acres. And yet there are two things of concern for me. One is we keep pushing on home ownership in our community, and that really is well beyond the means of the needed housing here. What we're missing here is rental housing that does not rent burden people, meaning you're not paying beyond what you can actually afford to rent. So our community, every time we build another $1 million home, we keep making it more unaffordable for those who are here in our community, born and raised in our community. So when we talk about clear and objective standards, the word needed is often put in front of the word housing, but that really needs a definition under what is the clear and objective of this housing. Who are you trying to house? So actually, getting back to Commissioner Kelly's comment, there are two insertions for a housekeeping unit at page 13 and at page 368. So that has been described in addition into your code. So a housekeeper might need housing. That would be another definition that you might want to include in your definitions. So I think what's really important at this stage of Deschutes County, we keep building lots more housing and we keep seeing this price ballooning and ballooning and ballooning. And that's great for realtors and builders and those on the open market, but it's making a social fissure in our community that really is not healthy. And as planners, I really encourage you to think about how we go about providing the housing that's actually needed. And that is in the statistics that are available to our community. It isn't just, the 3,500 new square foot house is the needed house for someone working in our community who might make $45,000 as a school teacher. That isn't what's needed in our community. So the other comment, I'm glad I came today to understand that the definitions is what you're reviewing here, but there are other stage 2 parts of this whole thing that are going to come up later for public review. So I'm wondering today, how today something is insured when there's a future module that isn't yet drafted or available for us to read today. How are you actually claiming that you're insuring this through this particular hearing when you're just doing the definitions? So I think we need a comprehensive package that gives people the chance to see the whole enchilada, then understand how the definition might play in that you're trying to put into a clear and objective term.
And
Under
Ms. Gould,
goal
we are
5
approaching our 3-minute on public testimony.
Okay, then I'd like the record to remain open for written comment. Again, there is a lot of material here, and I'd like you to keep the written record open so folks can write specifically on your to your page numbers, I think would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And Adam, do we have any public testimony online or on the phone? All right. So, yes.
I have a question for staff. So with regards to the record, is it normally I think we've been thinking we're going to do these one at a time, like this package, maybe deliberate on it and then do the next package and have a hearing and deliberate on it. Is it feasible process wise to have like leaving the written record open through the duration of the project, or do these really need to be wrapped up? Like, do we need to deliberate at each phase? Like, the reason why I ask is just because pertaining to Ms. Gould's comment, we may have other questions for staff as we go through. We might circle back and go, oh, this reminds me of the kitchen discussion. Can we get more input there? It would give the public longer to comment as they get familiar with the other sections of the packet. So I'm just wondering if it's even an option.
I mean, technically the commission can pursue whatever route that they want. You can leave the record open for as long as you would like to encourage public testimony. I can't really advise you one way or the other regarding that.
It doesn't like get in the way of logistically
I will say
trying to do.
there is kind of a state set deadline that we have no flexibility on, which is again that July 1st deadline. To speak to some of the school's concerns, I will say that these modules were they're intended to be designed so that one doesn't affect the others. So these proposed definitions, the measurement concerns, et cetera, we've kind of painstakingly gone through specifically and said, these are not going to affect our goal 5 inventories, for example, in any significant way. Obviously, some of these propagate throughout the entirety of the code, but in some sense, it is to piecemeal approach, starting with this most basic kind of foundational principles. Ideally, we have discussion surrounding that if everyone agrees on what those proposed terms are, et cetera. finalize that and then move to what are arguably more complicated discussions regarding, again, things like Goal 5 resources. We're going to have more complicated discussions. Our subdivision standards, for example, roads and streets, those kinds of things are ultimately forthcoming, and they will build upon this, but this should not change those foundationally at this stage. And so I can certainly understand the want to look at this globally. That's a pretty big ask, I would say, to digest, even in terms of staff that have been staring at this for over a year. It is difficult to have one, two, even a group of people that understand how everything works together collectively without breaking it apart into things that can be kind of evaluated in a piecemeal approach.
And I'd like to kind of emphasize a different angle on that, is that any rule that we have in our code that pertains to housing as not clear and objective ceases to exist on July 1st of this year. So if we have a thing that says you can't build a house that's a death trap, and we don't define what a death trap is, and that's not clear and objective, you can build a house that's a death trap, and we can't stop it from happening on July 1st. And so what you're seeing here in these definitions is an effort to deal with the easy and foundational stuff as quickly as possible, get it in the bag and have it usable and reliable for most of the citizens of Deschutes County for most purposes that we run into. As we go into the subsequent modules, we're dealing with things that happen less often, and maybe have less life health safety issues, for example. So we're really trying to get these things in the bag where we can, get them closed up, because if we did this all at once, I can guarantee you, I don't want to guarantee you, but dollars to donuts that the Goal 5 section is going to go into the courts. I think it's going to be really hard to get everyone to agree that how we try to change discretionary standards with regard to let's have a biologist think about this into a paint by numbers program is going to be hard, and not everyone's going to I think exactly no one will like it at the end. Is my anticipation. And maybe that's a sign we've done it right. So the idea of keeping this whole thing open while it's happening means that none of it gets done. July 1st will pass. We'll be at the Court of Appeals. We'll be at LUBA with the Goal 5 portions of this, and people won't know what they can put in their outbuildings. They won't know what goes in a kitchen. So really a strong push here to get some of this basic stuff that affects everybody and is relatively uncontroversial to get this stuff buttoned up as quickly as possible. Additionally, Cobb pointed to this, but in some of the other sections, if we don't know what a kitchen is and we don't know what a dwelling unit is, then the question of, in a wildlife area, when you have a density of dwelling units, that's maybe afforded under the current code, and we don't know really what that means, we're not going to be able to build that portion of it without having some of these foundational building blocks in place. So I definitely want to encourage, and we went down this path a long time. Should we keep it all open? Should we do it all at once? I mean, there's so many moving pieces and they loop back into each other, but we'd like to advocate strongly for let's try to get some of this buttoned up so that we can rely on it, so people can rely on it, and we don't run in a situation where nobody knows what they're supposed to be doing on even basic projects come the end of the year. And to the extent that we find out later on, let's say that we're pretty deep into the subdivision project and we find out that the definition that we put in the box for a kitchen is blowing that process up, there's nothing that stops us from coming back to it and saying, look, we made a good faith effort, kitchen looked good at the time, and now we're realizing that if we don't, in the subdivision process, if we don't add a comma here, it produces a really unintuitive result. There's nothing that we can't come back to in subsequent ordinance if we believe we've messed it up in some way. And I just want to have some humility here. We're changing huge parts of the code, and we're standing on the shoulders of giants, intellectual giants of Deschutes County. Some of you may know Liz Fancher. Karen Green was a hearings officer with us. Bruce White, an attorney and county counsel. Some of the smartest people I ever met wrote this code one line at a time, arguing over every word. And, some of these paragraphs took 6 months for people to fight their way through. And we are moving through it with a chainsaw, trying to respond to this statutory obligation. And I have the humility to know that I'm not the intellectual equal of any of those people. So recognizing that we will have to come back and fix this, we're going to be back, in 2026 to recognize that, that it turns out that the way kitchen works together with dwelling unit, works together with the Terrebonne code for multifamily dwelling, produces a weird result. And we're trying our best to catch all of them, and we're not going to, and we'll be back to fix some of this. So I think the notion that any of this, as it's adopted and moved forward, that it's the end of our tooling on this and trying to get it right, that's just not going to happen. I don't have the hubris to think we're going to get it right the first time. And if we get 90% of it right, I'm going to feel real good about it, that we did that well. And there's going to be stuff we're going to have to come back. We're going to back to. And so there's not, again, I want to emphasize that if we do put it away in segments, those we'll be back to those in any regard in important ways.
Just one other quick question. And I apologize, I don't remember, when is the next round of this occurring? Like our next module?
So we've got a number of modules that are all sort of getting close to the starting line.
So we don't have a date yet.
We don't have, none of them
Okay.
have dates
Okay.
certain, but the kind of the modules that are relatively close are the Title 17 module that has to do with land divisions and road standards. We received a DLCD grant and we're assigned a consultant, MIG Consulting, to work with that. And we've been kicking that back and forth with them, getting pretty close to something that looks like a draft. The same is true of the Goal 5 inventory modules, getting pretty close to something that, is a starting point. Kyle is assigned to a kind of a next module through Title 18. And so that includes kind of elements like multifamily housing and some of the other kind of provisions that we have. And that one is, it's still a dream and a bullet list.
So I just want to clarify for the commission, when I suggested that earlier, I didn't actually realize that these weren't coming like in a quick succession. So I'm just kind of withdrawing that comment. I didn't realize that that the timeline was that spread apart.
Yeah, I mean, Will probably has the best sense of any of this. I imagine that a lot of these are going to start to stack up as we approach this deadline. So as we get into kind of late spring, early summer, I think it's probably going to be a lot more of the like, now we're doing this and now we're doing this the next week. And a lot of them will be reviewed together.
Pulling all-nighters.
A lot of all-nighters.
Hopefully not for y'all.
One thing that is relatively complicated around, let's say this portion were left open, we're essentially having to talk about two separate sections of code every time we do this, if this is not buttoned up, because we can talk about like, well, if this passes, then we can review a portion that assumes that it's passed, or we can look at changing the code as it currently exists and basically having two separate channels to review everything. So there's definitely some lost efficiency in terms of doing all this. And again, I hate to advocate too strongly for one position or the other, but there's definitely an argument to be made that even if there's some broken pieces in this, as Will pointed out, we're almost certainly, once we start stress testing, we'll find those. We simply know that a large pieces of our code are going to go out the window in 6 months. And so it's in some ways the devil rather than the one you don't.
Commissioner Allman?
Well, I sort of had a question, but Commissioner Kiris addressed it. My question was related to the expectations of the Board of County Commissioners, because this is all going to have to go through a public hearing process with them as well. And if there had been a planned out schedule of when we would hear it and then when they would expect to have their own series of work sessions and public hearings and all of that, I think July sounds far away, and I think July is not far away when you look at this project. So I was just wondering if it had been planned out, but you answered Jessica's question, which was very similar to mine. So I think that's fine.
And to give a little bit of detail, that basically we're moving as quickly as we can. And what we keep finding out is it's a lot harder than we thought. We thought we were going to bring a definition of kitchens and accessory buildings that was going to be buttoned up, and we're going to be like, hey, this ink is dry. We like it. And then, we brought the definitions back in front of our current planning team again. And they said, oh, if you do this and then you do that, this weird thing happens. And we said, oh, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
We built things that deal with Kyle and I, as planners, have had certain experiences and, built a code that was robust in the face of that. And then, Caroline House had run into the garage door kitchen and came back with that. So, as we bring it back to other teams, or particularly as they see, oh, you change this definition, and when you put that definition into this piece of code, that code now does something unexpected. And so, we're really just the constant, how much the code is interconnected and changes in one place propagate to others and produce unwelcome effects just is constantly surprising. We set out on this project a year ago, honestly. And, my initial estimate was that we would be done with this part of it in 3 months. And we just over and over again, it's like recognizing how there's a fundamental problem. The word code, right? We say the word code like when you're programming on a computer. And the problem is that we're trying to program citizen behavior in English. And both of those are terrible ideas. One, trying to cause people to behave a particular way, and in particular, to try to do it with something as squirrely as the English language, where we all just barely agree with what it means in the best of times. And, you've seen the court cases famously that have turned on semicolons and commas and where they're at in a way that's barely intelligible. So the project has proved really, really daunting to try to do something that, we've avoided those things that we know we're making mistakes, and trying to get visibility on, what we might reasonably see in the future. So it's just been a slow process. So in terms of the schedule going forward, it is a sprint through molasses. And that, if we hit a clear spot, we're always moving as fast as we can. And Kyle has, every day that he continues to not run out of the building is a deeply appreciated one.
Yeah, I'll, maybe as kind of a final piece here, I'll also mention that one thing that we haven't really spoken about, because it's in some ways behind the scenes, is because this affects essentially every department in CDD, we're also having discussions around operationalizing some of these pieces of language. Because it's very easy to change words on a page, but that definitely means something when somebody comes into the office to submit plans. And we are often not the ones that are having to deal with that. And so we're constantly having to filter, well, what is that? If you change this or say this now, what does that mean in terms of what I need to request from a customer pursuing a particular development project? And sometimes that becomes so onerous that we need to kind of go back to the drawing board, which is why this is this constant iterative thing. Again, why language is being changed essentially up to the moment that I'm talking to you now. And likely will continue to change up to the moment that the board says, yep, we think this is the one. Go forward or don't.
Yeah, the sink example for the wet bar, we previously were interested in the size of the sink. The notion was well, if something's a smaller sink, people are less likely to try to use it as their kitchen sink. And what we found out is as we increasingly put numbers on what the wet bar had, the trap arm, the sink diameter, that we were dumping a lot of hard and difficult to track work on other divisions. And they were like, hey, you solved your problem and you made it ours. And so we had to come back and rework that in the face of trying to recognize that there are lots of players. And so every time we change something, we think, okay, who now is going to care about these things? And most of the time we guess it right. And sometimes people care about things that are surprising to us.
Okay.
So I think this is interesting for me to hear, because I did not understand that we would create it was kind of like a living document where we would kind of publish in multiple phases. In my understanding, it'd be we would do the comprehensive plan, we would do it, and then we would submit it as one. It's not that way. I'm interpreting this as we could submit sections at a time and make them live and then work on something else. So that's
definitely the goal, is to have, especially these foundational parts, for example, if we haven't agreed on what a height of a structure is, then later on, if we want to talk about what exceptions we might want to offer to that height restriction, for example, that becomes relatively difficult, especially when you try to merge that within the landscape management zone along rivers. There's a massing standard that also relies on a definition like height. So, these things stack on each other. And so a strong goal is to try to get some of this on the page, and then with some humility, with the notion that we might have to come back to some of these definitions that, hey, this package all worked together. As we came into package 2, it turns out that 3 things in package 1 are weird. So they're adopted and we're going to package 2 patch those 3 things going forward. And now in package 3, there's going to be a little, hopefully a narrowing iterative process where, we overwhelmingly get it right in most of these sections, but may have to come back.
Commissioner Cyrus.
Yeah, follow up. So catch up, something you just mentioned. If we go ahead and close this out and move on, we decide later that we need to readdress a definition of something, we can reopen it and address it at that point, I assume.
Yeah. So what would happen? Let's say, so before you today, we've spent maybe too much time previewing some of our tribulations with kitchens that will ultimately be visited upon the board. Right now there's a package in front of you that has, particular definitions and, so it's a point in time snapshot that was put to you in the public for feedback. So, one of the things that you might reasonably say, and you have, is, hey, what's going on with housekeeping unit? And we have some problems with kitchens. And so I would expect, it would seem likely to me that one of the things you would come back as you closed up this, you'd say, hey, we heard some testimony. I think broadly, this is a good package. We heard some discussion about ongoing work about kitchens and, removal of housekeeping unit. We'd be supportive of that as the board moves forward. We come to you with package 2, package 1, fingers crossed, is starting to get into an adoption process. And, we come into package 2 and you'd say, hey, actually this accessory building, it's producing a weird result here in package 2. Can we tinker with the accessory building definition? And the answer would be yes. You might add accessory building definition version 2.0 into package 2 because you realize how it all comes together. So again, a winnowing, a narrowing, an idea that we're going to get most of this right, and some of it we're going to be cycling back on. So definitely we wouldn't be wholesale, at least my goal would be not to be wholesale opening the definitions chapter again, but if particular definitions were proving problematic in the context, or you might say, hey, here we are in module 3, and something really occurred to me about the definitions that, it is causing a very unwelcome outcome. We'd say, oh, wow, let's, can we drop that into module 3? Do we need a module 4? That's where we're trying to just kind of keep moving and iterate and give some certainty without feeling over locked down to things that, choices we're making within a particular context.
I'm ready to make a motion.
Shall I give the options or would you like to just make a motion?
Does anyone need to hear the options?
All right.
Okay, well, I move to close the hearing and leave the written record open through the end of the business day, Thursday, January 16th, and commence deliberations on January 23rd at our meeting.
Second.
All righty. Any comments? All righty, we shall take a vote then. Vice Chair Karas, you vote to close the public hearing and leave the written testimony open until the end of day, January 16th, with deliberations to occur our next meeting on January 23rd. How about you, Vice Chair Karas?
I'm no longer the vice chair, but I vote.
Yeah. Commissioner Cyrus. Aye. Commissioner Hovkamp. Commissioner Kelly. Commissioner Stottkamp.
Aye.
Commissioner Altman. I too shall vote aye. So we have 7 ayes. We will close the public hearing. We will leave the written testimony open until the end of day, January 16th, and commence deliberations at our next meeting on January 23rd. So having closed the public hearing, we will move to our next item, which is planning and staff comments.
I'll go first. I just have one issue, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission. Just want to recognize we have a new administrative support technician. It's Adam Bale. Welcome, Adam. He is getting shadowed and trained and coached by a colleague of ours, Melinda, who works in information technology. So thanks to both of them for being here today. And we're very grateful to have Adam here to provide the technical support to have these meetings available both for those that want to be here in person and those that may want to participate remotely. So just wanted to welcome him as part of the team.
Thanks, Peter. For what I've got for you, I just wanted to acknowledge that, the board's given direction on RVs as rental dwellings, approving those with sideboards. And so we're in the process of bringing back sort of final text for their first reading and adoption, and also making sure that we've got the resources in place to allow that. There was a number of the Planning Commission concerns came through in association with that. One of the big ones was an increase in the acreage standard, which reduces the total number of properties that might be eligible for this. Also, to date, an ongoing interest in making sure that these are served by facilities such as, having full hookups and other things like that. So that's moving forward. Rulemaking, DLCD is engaged in a couple rounds of rulemaking associated with farm and forest regulations. Round one was primarily targeted in getting the Oregon revised statute and Oregon administrative rule in line with court cases that happened in recent years. And so they've where the court has said this section means this, they've made an effort to change the words in those sections so that a reader who wasn't aware of the case law would know how to operate that section of code. Those are already adopted into Oregon administrative rule and are already binding on people. With regard to certain uses in farm and forest zones, you'll see a housekeeping package coming through to update our code to make sure that people can easily find that information. We're kicking off, of course, we did the Tumalo plan most recently, and next up was the Newberry Country plan, and that's in its very early formulation stages with Nicole Mardell working on coordination on that. Another project that's coming out there that's still kind of, again, at the starting line. There'd been some interest and from the Board of County Commissioners as well as the City of Bend to think about land divisions near city boundaries. So one of the things that can happen when you have rural properties near city boundaries is it's possible that they're developed in a way that might be awkward for future city expansion. Under current rules, there's nothing that precludes you from putting your house on the center line of what would be ultimately one of the major roads coming out of town as the city expands over time. And there's been a question about what level of coordination is appropriate. There's a formal urban reserve process that the city has undertaken, but it's unlikely to have any results until 2027, 2028. And so the board and the city have both shown interest in, and DLCD has given us grant dollars to explore if there's interest in and benefit to rules potentially limiting development in the rural county near cities with regard to land divisions and location of structures to ensure that the city can expand with sort of minimum difficulty. That's something that's really an open question. That's something that the board has both showed an interest in exploring and really not a strong determination if they want to engage in that project at all ultimately, but they were willing to have that conversation. Medical hardship dwellings. So you're allowed to, on most properties, have an RV or a manufactured home put on your property to care for a relative who is experiencing a medical condition, or when you might have a medical condition that would benefit from on-property care from another person. And those rules between the local county rules that we adopted and the state rules have diverged in ways that are confusing to people over time. So really a borderline housekeeping effort there to get those rules in sync about who can have these medical hardship dwellings and what's required to get one. Childcare, something of consistent interest to both the Planning Commission and the board. The state rules for childcare have gotten a lot clearer over time, and our code has not kept up with that. So we've got some of our staff looking at making, again, borderline housekeeping changes to that. There's a couple choices that'll be made. So, when that comes before you, you'll see a presentation that says these things are mandated under state law. We're catching up. And here's some space where we were afforded choices about how we approach childcare. What do you want to do with that? So not truly housekeeping, because there will be some policy choices in there. We talked a little bit about the clear and objective updates modules that are coming through. And so we've got staff working on that as well. And so this is really kind of a very early season preview of what's coming up in the next year, what's our long range staff is working on right now. None of these are calendared or in front of you at this point, but you'll definitely, all of them will be coming your way before the end of the year.
I can end on one thing. I hesitate to bring this up as the last thing. Most of the commissioners are probably aware that the state wildfire hazard map was released this week by the Oregon Department of Forestry. For anybody listening at home, You can find a copy of that map online. It's called the Oregon Explorer. It's an interactive map. You can search for your specific property address. A few points of clarification that I don't think the Department of Forestry has been particularly clear about, but I just want to put out there, which is this map has been released. It sets off two big things that have yet to happen. One is an appeals process. So any property owners that would be subject to new regulations, and I say would because they haven't been put in place yet, should have received information around how to go through an appeals process if they wanted to appeal their hazard designation. All those appeals need to be submitted to the Department of Forestry by March 10th. That's the deadline that they've set, either postmarked by March 10th or submitted electronically by that date. Even though the map itself has been adopted and after all the appeals have been exhausted, so the map is truly final in whatever form that takes, there's still a rulemaking process that has to go into place before any new regulations that apply to development are going to be put on the ground. The big two that we've talked about a million times at this point are fire hardening standards, the actual materials your home is going to be constructed out of. That'll ultimately apply to new dwellings and significant modifications of existing dwellings going forward. And then defensible space standards, which have also not been formalized at this point. We don't know exactly when that rulemaking process is going to take place. It's been telegraphed that it might happen this spring, this summer, but even after that takes place, they've suggested over and over again that there likely will still be kind of a phase-in period. So once the rules have been adopted at a state level, it'll probably take at least a year from that point before anything actually starts happening. There's a few kind of asterisks there, which is there are portions in state law that the map applies to as of now, as of Tuesday when it was released. But those are relatively minor in nature. They deal with things like replacement dwellings in the EFU zone. ADUs is another one that has some effects on the ground today. But for the most part, people should be aware, go look at the map, but nothing's going to happen at this point.
Commissioner Hofkamp, any comments?
Yeah, just briefly, congratulations, staff generally, Kyle in particular, for getting this first big tranche moved on, big piece of work. This is just sort of one part of it, our role in it. So congratulations. I look forward to the next tranche. This seemed to work fairly well. They'll necessarily come to us in large packets. The more that you can give thought to how we can be used most usefully or productively by guiding us, to particular areas that are of special importance or attention, the better, maybe. So thanks for that. And then just a general comment to my colleagues, I guess. I appreciate that we need to be in conformance with state law and that this is a state mandate for clear and objective standards. I appreciate that many people are concerned about housing crisis, if we want to use that word. But when we're looking across the code, and especially with future tranches that come to us, and multiple allusions to Goal 5 or chapters that have more to do with natural resources, there are many crises out there, and housing is certainly one. I would point to crises that I'm sensitive to about wildlife habitat degradation and fragmentation, endangered species, loss of biodiversity. And I guess I'm just wary of when we apply one lens, a housing lens, across an entire document that's meant to guide every aspect of the way the county looks and functions, that we keep in mind that there are other imperatives, crises, and lenses with which we can look at code language, so that we don't do more harm than good. And I appreciate very much, Will, the humility with which you approached, saying that there was a lot of work and thought that went into constructing these codes, and you're kind of being asked under a tight timeline to take a chainsaw to this. I'm not sure that it's the worst possible outcome that we don't meet the July 1st deadline in regards to some of the code revisions. I'm sure we'll do our best. I'm sure you'll do your best. But it might be that there's a worse outcome to our efforts here than simply missing that deadline in the effort to be thoughtful about all of the different perspectives and implications of what we do as we tweak language under a tight timeline. I'm concerned about that because of the potential impact to resources and other sort of chapters that are coming up. So anyway, thank you, colleagues, for that. Yeah.
Commissioner Kelly.
Thank you, and congratulations to our new chair and co-chair. I'm excited to have some new voices, and thank you, Tony, for your service. You did a fantastic job and ran, wonderful meetings. So thank you, and I guess here's to a new year.
Yes.
Of leadership, and thank you for your comments. That I was kind of, with this whole timeline, and I understand that you guys have this timeline, and it's important to stay mandate. And I was reminded that my dad always told me, don't be quick to make a bad decision. And so I think, I know that you guys will guide us in a thoughtful manner, and I look forward to it. But I do think that's a valid comment. And yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Kyle, very much for all your explanation. It's very interesting to see how the sausage is made. It really helps me understand and then therefore explain to others why certain codes are the way they are. And so I'm just, very appreciative that the time you take into the explanation. So thank you.
Of course.
Commissioner Stockamp.
Yeah, just wanted to thank everyone here for a productive conversation tonight around the clear and objective standards. I want to extend the gratitude to Chair Williams and Vice Chair Kiris for serving this year, and excited for what's ahead with Chair Cyrus and Vice Chair Altman and all the discussions. This will be my first full year serving now, so excited to be a part of the whole thing.
New elect Vice Chair Altman.
Thank you. Just really ditto what everybody else said. Thank you always to staff. I'm always amazed at your professionalism when you're working here late at night and you've been under deadlines with a lot of work. I ditto everybody's comments so far. Thank you to Chair and Vice Chair Williams and Kiris, and future Chair Cyrus. I look forward to another year.
Future Chair Cyrus.
Thank you. I just like to extend appreciation to all your work and efforts and what you've done this past year, and also to Vice Chair Kiris for her efforts, and look forward to a productive year.
Commissioner Kiris.
I also want to thank you guys. As I was reading through the 754 pages or whatever the exact number was, I'm just in awe of the scope of this project. It's kind of mind-boggling, and just thinking about like what you guys are doing, just like, whoa. So great job. It's seconding what Commissioner Hovkamp said. It's always good to hear feedback of like what's the most useful role for us to play, because you've got MIG, amazing consultant. You guys are experts. I know at one point, Will, you said the comprehensive plan was like the Olympics of planning. But this also seems like if that's the Olympics, this is like the World Championship. So we're citizens, so we're here to provide the citizen perspective, but also, like it's a little bit daunting to go like, wow, this is extremely technical and requires really high level expertise. So I want to make sure we just keep bringing helpful stuff to the table. And along those lines, I really liked everyone's questions and thought that the conversation ended up being really engaging, despite the technicality of this. But I just want to extend a special kudos to Kelsey, because I just really appreciated your questions from the standpoint of a real estate agent with just who looks at hundreds of homes like all the time, and hundreds and thousands of homes really. So it just was really nice to get your input and so see it through your lens. And then yeah, finally I'm excited for new chair and vice chair, and I appreciate you guys stepping up and being willing to do that. So thanks everyone.
And as my final thought as chair, thank you and welcome, Adam. We are going to appreciate your assistance throughout the year. Sometimes we have some blurps in the system, and we try to deal with it. It has been wonderful being the chair for you folks this last year, and I look forward to new perspectives and new leadership. Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you so much. And at 7:53 or 7:43, pardon me, we will close the first meeting of the Deschutes County Planning Commission, January 9th, 2025.